For 61-year-old Evelyn Moore, success had never been the problem. She was the woman other people pointed to when they said, "You can have it all." A self-made tech entrepreneur, she'd built her company from a second-hand laptop in her garage and turned it into a multi-million-dollar empire before most of her peers had even figured out what retirement meant. Her portrait had been printed in business magazines. Her quotes were posted on motivational pages. But behind the glossy smiles and elegant pantsuits, there was a silence Evelyn never talked about, a silence that followed her home every night. Her mansion on the edge of Lake Crescent looked like something out of an Architectural Digest spread. White marble floors, glass walls overlooking the water, and a terrace filled with roses that no one ever sat among. When the sun went down, the only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of what's settling. She would pour herself a glass of red wine, open a novel she'd already read, and pretend the words could drown out the loneliness. Evelyn had been divorced for almost 15 years. Her ex-husband had moved to Arizona, remarried, and started over. Their only daughter, Laura, now 35, worked as a homicide detective in Portland. Laura called every week, but the calls were brief. 5 minutes of checking in, promises to visit soon, and then the click of the line going quiet. Evelyn never complained. She knew Laura's job was demanding. Still, the silence afterward always lingered longer than it should have. For a woman who had once commanded boardrooms, Evelyn now found herself negotiating with loneliness instead. The days blurred together. Yoga at sunrise, coffee at the same cafe where no one remembered her name, walks along the lakeshore where she greeted strangers just to hear her own voice. Retirement was supposed to be freedom, but to Evelyn it felt like exile. People admired her independence, but she knew better. Independence was just another word for no one's coming home to you tonight. On holidays, she tried to make the house feel alive. She'd decorate, bake her late mother's favorite lemon cake, and set an extra plate at the table, just in case. But no one came. Her few remaining friends had drifted into their own worlds, and though she received their Christmas cards, none ever contained an invitation. The glittering world that had once revolved around her name had moved on. There was a photo Evelyn kept on her nightstand, taken 20 years earlier on a company retreat. She was laughing, head tilted back, eyes full of light. Sometimes she stared at it for long minutes, wondering where that version of herself had gone. Maybe she'd buried her under years of deadlines, profits, and polite smiles. Maybe that woman had simply grown tired of waiting for someone to see her, not her resume. She'd dated occasionally after her divorce. Men her age, mostly widowers or businessmen she met at conferences. The conversations were polite but hollow, full of small talk and gentle reminders that she was too intimidating. Younger men flirted too, but she brushed them off with a practiced laugh. In her mind, attraction from someone half her age wasn't romance. It was a setup for humiliation. And yet, as she watched couples strolling hand in hand through the park, or an elderly pair sharing ice cream on a bench, something in her ached. Not for youth, not even for passion, but for connection. For someone who would ask how her day was and actually want to know the answer. Still, she told herself she was fine. Fine had become her armor. Polished, strong, unshakable. It kept people from asking questions she didn't want to answer. One autumn evening, Evelyn sat on her terrace watching the sky bleed from gold to indigo. The lake reflected the last light like a sheet of glass. Somewhere in the distance, music drifted from a community fundraiser she'd been invited to but hadn't planned to attend. She sipped her wine and smiled to herself, thinking, not tonight. I'm done chasing things that aren't real. But destiny, as it often does in the stories that start too quietly, was already moving toward her. At that very fundraiser she'd chosen to skip, a man named Marcus Reed was scanning the crowd with patient precision, waiting for a woman exactly like her. And in less than a week, Evelyn Moore, the woman who thought she'd already lived her story, would meet him. And nothing in her life would ever be quiet again. The night Evelyn Moore finally met Marcus Reed, she wasn't looking for anyone. She'd forced herself to attend the Lake Crescent Community Gala, an annual charity event she used to sponsor back when she was still Evelyn Moore, CEO of More Tech. Now, she was just Evelyn, the woman in the corner with a polite smile and a half-finished glass of Chardonnay. The ballroom shimmered under chandeliers, full of laughter and clinking glasses. Conversations floated around her, deals, gossip, vacation plans. All the same noise she'd once lived for. But tonight, it only made her feel smaller, older. When the band started playing an upbeat jazz tune, Evelyn slipped toward the quiet edges of the room, grateful for a moment of solitude. That was when he appeared. "Beautiful evening, isn't it?" a warm voice said. Evelyn turned, slightly startled. The man before her looked like he'd stepped out a magazine ad, tall, well-dressed, with a sharp jawline and an easy, confident smile. His suit fit perfectly, his tie a tasteful navy silk. But it wasn't just the looks, it was his presence. The kind of charm that drew attention without demanding it. "I'm sorry," Evelyn said, returning his smile politely. "Have we met?" "Not yet," he said. "Marcus Reed." He extended his hand. "You used to run More Tech, right? I've heard about you." The woman who turned code into gold. Evelyn chuckled, surprised that anyone still remembered. "That was a long time ago. Great legacies don't expire," Marcus said smoothly. "They just evolve." The compliment was subtle, but it landed. Evelyn hadn't realized how much she missed hearing her accomplishments spoken with admiration, without envy, without pretense. For the first time that evening, she felt seen. Marcus didn't overdo it. He didn't flirt, not exactly. Instead, he listened, asked thoughtful questions, told stories about his supposed investment firm in Portland, about growing up with a single mother who taught him how to survive with style. He laughed easily, but never too loudly. When Evelyn mentioned her daughter, Laura, his eyes softened. "A detective? That's incredible. You must be proud." By the time the gala ended, Marcus had offered to walk her to her car. "Only if you don't mind some company," he said, his tone light but respectful. Evelyn hesitated, then nodded. The night air was cool and fragrant with pine. As they walked through the parking lot, Evelyn found herself smiling, really smiling for the first time in a long while. When they reached her car, Marcus looked at her with a quiet sincerity. "Can I say something without sounding forward?" he asked. She raised an eyebrow. "That depends on what it is. I'm glad I met you tonight. You have this calm energy about you. It's rare." Evelyn felt heat rise to her cheeks. "That's a new one," she said with a soft laugh. "Then I guess I'm already making history," Marcus replied. He didn't ask for her number that night. He didn't need to. When Evelyn returned home, there was already an email waiting for her, a simple thank you for the conversation, signed M. From there it began. Marcus started appearing everywhere she went, casually, coincidentally. At her favorite cafe, at a community book fair, even at the lakeside trail she walked on weekends. Always with the same easy smile, always respectful, never intrusive. He had an uncanny way of showing up just when she seemed most alone. At first, Evelyn found it flattering. Maybe it was fate. Maybe the universe had finally decided to give her a second chance at companionship. What she didn't know was that Marcus had planned every encounter. He'd spent weeks studying her, through social media, charity newsletters, and online articles that still chronicled her career. He knew her habits, her favorite spots, her weaknesses. Evelyn wasn't his first chance meeting. Marcus had played this game before. In 3 different states, under 3 different names, he had wooed, married, and buried women just like her, wealthy, independent, and quietly lonely. Each time, he reinvented himself with surgical precision. Sometimes a financial consultant, sometimes a real estate investor, sometimes a widower with a tragic past. Always attentive, always trustworthy, always too good to be true. Evelyn, of course, had no way of knowing. She saw only a charming young man who made her laugh, who seemed genuinely interested in her stories. He sent her handwritten notes, little reminders of their conversations, a quote from a book she mentioned, a photo of the lake they both loved. He made her feel seen, understood, cherished. And so, when he finally invited her to dinner, nothing fancy, just 2 friends talking about life, she said yes. At the restaurant, Marcus chose a table by the window overlooking the water. The lighting was soft, the atmosphere intimate. He listened to her talk about her late nights, building more tech, about the loneliness of success. He reached across the table, gently brushing her hand. "You deserve to be cared for," he said quietly. "You spend your whole life taking care of others. When was the last time someone took care of you?" Evelyn looked at him, speechless. She didn't realize that behind that tender gaze was calculation, that Marcus was watching her every expression, noting every emotional opening. To her, it felt like connection. To him, it was confirmation. That night, when he dropped her off and she thanked him for a lovely evening, Marcus smiled to himself as he walked away. He had her exactly where he wanted her, and she didn't even know it yet. For the first time in years, Evelyn Moore felt alive. The mornings didn't feel as heavy. She found herself smiling at small things, the scent of coffee, the sound of rain, the message that always arrived from Marcus right before sunrise. "Good morning, beautiful. I hope today treats you kindly." Marcus had a way of making everything feel effortless. He remembered every little thing. Her favorite tea, the story behind the scar on her wrist, even the kind of flowers her mother used to plant in their old garden. His gestures weren't grand, but precise, intimate, and consistent. A handwritten note left on her doorstep. A playlist sent for your long evening walks. A book, he said, reminded me of your strength. It all felt genuine because it was designed to. What Evelyn didn't know was that Marcus treated her emotions like data. Each word, each sigh, each confession stored away, analyzed, and used to deepen her attachment. He didn't just want her love, he wanted her trust, and he was patient enough to earn it. Evelyn had always been careful, even skeptical, when it came to relationships. But Marcus disarmed her in ways she didn't expect. He never rushed her. He seemed content with slow walks, quiet dinners, long conversations about life and loss. He listened, really listened, the way no one else ever had. When she spoke about her late parents or her regrets, he didn't try to fix anything. He just let her speak. And that's how he slipped in, not through charm, but through empathy. Her friends were divided. Some were thrilled she'd found a spark again. Others whispered behind her back, calling Marcus a gold digger. Evelyn laughed it off. They just don't know him, she thought. They don't see how genuine he is. Marcus knew exactly how to reinforce that belief. Whenever Evelyn mentioned the rumors, he looked hurt, not angry, just wounded. "I get it," he'd say softly. "People talk. But I'm not here for your money, Evelyn. I'm here for you. You're different." And she believed him. Weeks turned into months, and Marcus became a permanent fixture in her life. He cooked her breakfast, repaired things around the house, even joined her on business luncheons where he charmed everyone with his manners and easy humor. He made her feel protected, adored, and, most dangerous of all, safe. It was around this time that Marcus began weaving the real trap. He started small, talking about simplifying life. He told Evelyn she worked too hard to worry about paperwork and finances. "You should be enjoying your retirement, not managing spreadsheets," he'd tease. He offered to help, to organize her investments, just to take some stress off her shoulders. Evelyn hesitated. She'd built her empire on control. Letting anyone into her finances felt unnatural. But Marcus played his part flawlessly. He didn't push, he planted ideas. "If something ever happened to me," he said one night, "I'd want you to be secure. You deserve that." The next week, he casually mentioned adding her as a joint account holder on one of his investment portfolios. She saw it as a gesture of trust. She didn't realize it was bait, the kind that made her feel obligated to reciprocate. Soon after, Marcus began handling small errands, renewing insurance policies, signing minor documents. He'd insist on transparency. "We're a team, remember?" But he'd always be the one to mail the forms, to make the calls. Step by step, he gained access. Passwords, security questions, digital keys. By the time Evelyn noticed how deeply he'd embedded himself into her life, it was too late. One evening, while preparing dinner together, she mentioned feeling tired, short of breath. Marcus smiled sympathetically. "You're pushing yourself too hard again," he said. "Did you take your medication today?" He handed her a glass of water and her daily pills, the same ones he'd started managing for her so she wouldn't forget. That night, She felt dizzy and weak, but brushed it off as stress. Marcus tucked her into bed, kissed her forehead, and whispered, "Rest, my love. Tomorrow will be better." In the dim glow of the bedroom, he stood by the door for a moment, watching her drift off. The faintest smile touched his lips, not one of affection, but of victory. Everything was working exactly as planned. To the world, their relationship looked perfect, the elegant older woman and her charming younger husband-to-be. To Evelyn, it felt like destiny. But to Marcus Reed, it was nothing more than step 3 in a process he had perfected: win their hearts, gain their trust, control their lives, and soon end them. Spring sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows of St. Margaret's Chapel, casting soft amber light over the small gathering. It was a simple ceremony, elegant, understated, almost too quiet for someone like Evelyn Moore, who had once hosted galas that filled entire ballrooms. But that was precisely how Marcus wanted it. No reporters, no large guest list, just the people who matter. To Evelyn, the intimacy felt romantic. To Marcus, it was strategic. He'd been planning this moment for months, rehearsing every word, every smile. He'd studied her rhythms, her hesitations, even the way she clutched her pearl necklace when she felt uncertain. When he took her hands that morning, he knew exactly how to make her believe that saying yes was the safest thing she could do. "You've rebuilt your life, Evelyn," he whispered as they stood before the altar. "Now let me be part of it." Her voice trembled as she said the words she hadn't imagined uttering again. "I do." The handful of guests, mostly Evelyn's old colleagues and 2 of her bridge club friends, clapped politely. Her daughter, Detective Laura Moore, stood off to the side, her expression carefully neutral. She hugged her mother afterward, but her embrace was stiff, guarded. "He seems charming," Laura said. "Don't start," Evelyn warned softly, half smiling. "You're overthinking, as always." But Laura wasn't overthinking. She was observing. The way Marcus's hand lingered possessively on Evelyn's back, how his eyes scanned the room, not with affection, but with calculation, as if he were measuring his surroundings. Something in her gut whispered that her mother's new husband wasn't who he claimed to be. The newlyweds returned to Evelyn's lakefront home later that evening. Marcus insisted on cooking dinner himself, seared salmon, her favorite. He poured wine, lit candles, and played soft jazz through the speakers. Everything looked perfect, the kind of night Evelyn had dreamt of during all those lonely years. They toasted to new beginnings, and for a fleeting moment, Evelyn allowed herself to believe in them. But beneath the glow of the candles, Marcus's mind was elsewhere, running through a mental checklist. He had already accessed her accounts, updated the beneficiary forms, and transferred key documents into his possession. All that remained was time, and the quiet certainty that time was already on his side. After dinner, Evelyn confessed she'd been feeling tired lately. Marcus gave her a tender smile and said, "That's just the wedding stress, love. You're fine." He made sure she took her medication, the same pills he'd been replacing with harmless substitutes for weeks. Later that night, as they stood on the terrace overlooking the moonlit lake, Evelyn turned to him and said softly, "You made me feel young again." Marcus wrapped his arms around her from behind. "You've always been young," he murmured. "You just needed someone to remind you." He kissed her hair, and for a brief second, he almost believed his own lie. 2 days later, the fairy tale ended. It was a quiet evening. Evelyn had just finished setting the table. Roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, the kind of homey meal she hadn't made in years. Marcus poured the wine, his movements smooth and deliberate. They laughed about small things, her attempt at learning Italian, his claim that he'd once worked as a barista in Rome. Everything looked ordinary. Then, in the middle of a sentence, Evelyn stopped. Her hand trembled. The color drained from her face. She reached for her chest, gasping. Marcus froze for half a heartbeat, just long enough to confirm it was happening, then sprang into action, voice trembling with perfectly rehearsed panic. "Evelyn? Evelyn, stay with me." He called 911, his tone full of desperate urgency. Paramedics arrived within minutes, finding him kneeling beside her, holding her hand, his shirt stained with spilled wine. He rode in the ambulance, weeping, whispering that everything would be okay. It wasn't. At 9:47 p.m., Evelyn Moore was pronounced dead. Cause of death: heart failure, consistent with her medical history. No signs of foul play. The doctors offered condolences. The neighbors sent flowers. Marcus played his part flawlessly, the grieving widower, devastated but dignified. Only one person didn't believe him. Standing in the hospital hallway, her badge clipped to her belt, Laura Moore stared through the glass at her mother's still form. Her instinct screamed that this wasn't natural. Her mother had been fine just days before, happy, glowing, finally alive again. Something was wrong, and Laura Moore, detective and daughter, was about to find out exactly what it was. Detective Laura Moore had seen hundreds of death reports in her career, victims of overdoses, domestic violence, carefully staged accidents. She'd trained herself to separate emotion from evidence. But this time she couldn't, because this time the victim was her mother. The hospital had ruled Evelyn Moore's death natural. Congestive heart failure, a convenient explanation that made everyone comfortable. Everyone except Laura. She replayed the last time they spoke, just hours before Evelyn's collapse. Her mother had sounded lighthearted, vibrant even, teasing Laura for working too much and promising to send her a photo of the dinner Marcus was cooking. There was no sign of distress, no weakness in her voice, nothing that pointed to a woman on the verge of dying. At the wake, Laura stood near the back of the chapel, silent. Marcus was at the front, dressed immaculately in black, his face a study in controlled grief. He greeted guests with polite sorrow, repeating the same line over and over. She was the love of my life. Laura watched him closely. Every gesture seemed rehearsed. When he dabbed his eyes, the tissue remained dry. When people offered condolences, he paused just long enough to make the silence feel heavy. It was too perfect a performance, not pain. Later that evening, when most guests had left, Laura approached him. "I'll need copies of my mother's medical records," she said evenly. Marcus blinked, feigning confusion. "Why would you need that?" "It's standard procedure for the estate," she lied. He hesitated just for a second before nodding. "Of course, whatever you need." That hesitation was enough. In the days that followed, Laura used her connections in the department to quietly request a toxicology report. Officially, she wasn't on the case, but unofficially, she couldn't stay away. When the report came back, the numbers made her stomach twist. Her mother had died from a lethal overdose of her own heart medication, a dose far beyond what was prescribed. The pills were the same brand, the same bottle, but the contents didn't match the pharmacy records. Someone had tampered with them, and only one person had access. Laura sat alone in her apartment that night, staring at the report. Anger simmered beneath her grief. She thought about Marcus, how quickly he'd moved into Evelyn's life, how seamlessly he'd integrated himself. Every instinct she'd suppressed before the wedding now roared to the surface. She needed proof. The next morning, she visited Evelyn's bank. The manager recognized her immediately. "Your mother came in a few weeks ago," he said kindly. Such a lovely woman. She mentioned updating her beneficiary forms. Newlywed excitement, I suppose. Laura's pulse quickened. "Do you have a copy of those forms?" The manager hesitated. "Well, yes, they're part of the estate record now." She looked down at the papers. Marcus Reed, sole beneficiary of all personal accounts, life insurance, and investments. Everything. It was all there in black and white. Laura leaned back, heart pounding. "He didn't just kill her," she whispered. "He planned it." That evening, she returned to her mother's house. The place now eerily quiet, smelling faintly of lavender and cleaning polish. Marcus had already moved out, leaving behind a few of his things. In a medicine cabinet, Laura found a prescription bottle. The seal was broken, the pills slightly off color. She took it as evidence. On Evelyn's desk, she discovered a handwritten note Marcus had left weeks earlier. It read, "You've given me something I never thought I'd have again, purpose. I'll spend the rest of my life making you feel safe." Laura felt her jaw tighten. It wasn't love. It was possession. She began digging into his past, running background checks through every database available. What she found didn't add up. No real employment history, no family, no consistent address. But what did emerge was chilling. A trail of women. 4 of them. All older, all wealthy, all dead within a year of marrying a man who looked just like Marcus Reed, though under different names. Derek Cole, Adrian Hunt, Malik Grant, Ethan Rowe. Each death had been ruled accidental. Each estate had been transferred to the surviving husband. Laura felt her breath catch. The man her mother had loved wasn't just a liar. He was a serial predator, a killer who'd turned marriage into murder. And if she didn't act fast, he'd do it again. Laura picked up her phone and called a trusted colleague in the homicide unit. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled. "I'm sending you a name," she said. "Marcus Reed. I need everything on him. Aliases, marriages, travel, financials. He's killed before, and I'm not letting him get away with it again." As she hung up, she looked toward the framed photo of her mother, smiling by the lake. "You built an empire once, Mom," she whispered. "Now it's my turn to bring yours justice." Detective Laura Moore had been in investigations long enough to know that predators like Marcus Reed rarely left clean trails, but they always left patterns. And patterns were her specialty. She started piecing together the fragments: marriage licenses, death certificates, property records, and insurance claims, all linked to different names but the same face. Each time, the man appeared charming, attentive, generous. Each time, the woman was older, financially independent, and newly vulnerable. And each time, within months, she was dead. The deeper Laura dug, the more monstrous the pattern became. In San Diego, under the name Derek Cole, he married a 58-year-old widow named Linda Farrell. She died in a bathtub accident, the coroner ruling it a heart attack. In Denver, as Adrian Hunt, he'd wooed retired art dealer Margaret Sloan. She fell down her staircase. And in Atlanta, Malik Grant had been the grieving husband of Dr. Teresa Blake, who supposedly suffered complications from diabetes. Each case was closed quickly, with the husband walking away richer and devastated. Marcus, or whatever name he'd chosen then, had perfected his routine. Laura brought the evidence to her captain, Lieutenant Harris, laying the files across his desk. "He's killed at least 4 women," she said flatly. "And now my mother." Harris frowned. "You're sure? These cases span multiple states. Different names, different jurisdictions. We'll need to connect them solidly." Laura slid a photo across the table. Marcus's mug from a traffic stop in Nevada 5 years earlier. Same eyes, same smile, same birthmark under his jawline. The captain studied it, then exhaled. "All right, we'll loop in the FBI." For weeks, Laura worked alongside federal agents, tracing Marcus's digital footprints. What they found was chilling. He'd used prepaid phones, fake IDs, offshore accounts, but his arrogance had left small cracks. Receipts from high-end jewelers in multiple cities under aliases. Airline tickets purchased with slight variations of his name. One was Marcus Reed, another Marcus Reed. All led back to the same bank account, hidden under a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. A financial predator, a murderer in a suit. When the FBI pulled old surveillance footage from one of the jewelry stores, Laura froze. The man in the video smiled directly into the camera. Marcus, holding hands with another woman. His next target, maybe? They traced the woman through store records. Charlotte Green, 55, a wealthy entrepreneur from Phoenix. She'd recently posted engagement photos with Marcus on social media. Under the caption, "Found love again." Laura's heart dropped. He was doing it again. The agents obtained a warrant for surveillance and wiretap authorization. Within days, they intercepted Marcus's messages, dinner plans, affectionate voice notes, and one that made Laura's blood run cold. "Don't forget your pills tonight, baby. I'll bring them to you." She knew that line. She heard it before. The task force moved fast. They placed Marcus under surveillance, tailing him as he left Charlotte's house with a small paper bag. Inside, her prescription bottles, already opened. It was enough. The arrest came quietly, just after midnight. Marcus was leaving Charlotte's driveway when unmarked vehicles blocked both ends of the street. Agents surrounded his car, guns drawn. For once, Marcus didn't smile. "Marcus Reed," an agent called out, You're under arrest for the murder of Evelyn Moore and multiple counts of fraud and identity theft." He didn't resist, just stared at Laura, who stepped out from the shadows, badge in hand. Their eyes locked, predator and prey, roles reversed. "You think you're the first person to catch me?" he said softly, smirking. "You're not even close." Laura didn't flinch. "Maybe not," she replied, "but I'll be the last." At headquarters, the interrogation began. Marcus refused to speak without a lawyer, his composure unnerving. Yet behind that calm exterior, Laura could see something new: fear. His world, built on lies and charm, was finally collapsing. Evidence flooded in. Handwriting analysis tied him to forged documents. Forensic chemists confirmed the pills found in Evelyn's home had been swapped. Bank transfers showed money funneled from each victim's estate into his offshore account. And Charlotte's toxicology test, ordered just in time, revealed traces of a sedative. It was over. Laura sat in the observation room as the agents read Marcus's rights. For the first time in months, she felt the weight lift from her chest. Her mother's killer, the man who would play husband, caretaker, and executioner, was exposed. As they led Marcus down the hallway in cuffs, Laura watched through the glass. He glanced back, his charming facade gone, replaced by something raw and venomous. But she didn't look away. He had spent years studying women like Evelyn Moore. Now the world would spend years studying him, behind bars, where charm could no longer save him. The trial of Marcus Reed was everything the media craved: wealth, betrayal, and a serial killer who didn't fit the mold. He wasn't a drifter or a thug. He was polished, articulate, and chillingly calm. A man who used romance as a weapon and love as his camouflage. The courthouse in Seattle overflowed with reporters. Headlines called him the Widowmaker, the Groom of Death, and the man who married to murder. Cameras flashed as Marcus was escorted inside in an orange jumpsuit, wrists chained, his once charming smile replaced by the faintest smirk, the kind of smirk that said he still thought he could talk his way out of this. At the prosecution table sat Detective Laura Moore, not as an officer this time, but as a daughter. The ache of loss still haunted her eyes, but beneath it burned quiet fury. For months, she had gathered evidence, tied aliases together, and built the case that exposed her mother's killer. Now, justice depended on whether 12 strangers could see through the same lies that had fooled Evelyn. The lead prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Karen Lee, opened the case with deliberate force. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, pacing before the jury, "this is not a story about love. This is a story about control, greed, and murder, committed by a man who has turned marriage into a method of execution." She laid out the evidence piece by piece: the falsified financial documents, the altered prescriptions, the trail of dead wives stretching across 4 states. Each exhibit tore at the illusion Marcus had built. Photos of smiling women: Linda Farrell, Margaret Sloan, Teresa Blake, and finally Evelyn Moore, filled the courtroom screen. Each one believed they'd found love. Each one was dead within months. When it was time for the defense, attorney Grant Ellis painted a different picture. Marcus as a misunderstood romantic, a victim of circumstance, hounded by grief and coincidence. "There is no proof my client intentionally harmed anyone," Ellis insisted. "Yes, he made mistakes, but being charming isn't a crime." Marcus played his role perfectly. On the stand, his voice was smooth, his eyes glistening with manufactured tears. He spoke of Evelyn as his soulmate, of the joy she brought into his life, and of his devastation at her loss. "I loved her," he whispered, looking toward the jury. "I still do." It was almost convincing, until Laura testified. When she took the stand, the courtroom went silent. She spoke not as a detective, but as a daughter who had watched her mother fall for a predator. Her testimony was measured but cutting, every word grounded in fact. She described the tampered medication, the bank transfers, the aliases. Then she turned toward Marcus, her voice steady but cold. "You told my mother you'd take care of her," she said. "And you did, by making sure she never saw another sunrise." Marcus looked at her with his familiar half-smile, the same one that had fooled Evelyn. But this time, Laura didn't look away. The prosecution called its final witnesses, the families of Marcus's other victims. Their stories echoed each other. Whirlwind romances, rushed weddings, mysterious deaths. Each woman had trusted him completely. Each had died soon after adding him to her will. The pattern was undeniable. Then came the forensic bombshell. A toxicologist presented proof that the medication found in Evelyn's system contained trace compounds of sorbitol and binder residue from sugar tablets, confirming Marcus had replaced her heart pills with placebos. When her body finally failed, it was because she'd unknowingly been taking candy instead of life-saving medication. The jury sat frozen. The courtroom air turned thick. For the first time, Marcus's composure cracked. His jaw tightened. His eyes darted toward the evidence screen. Prosecutor Lee ended her closing statement with quiet power. He didn't strangle them, shoot them, or stab them. He killed them with trust. He weaponized love, and he believed no one would notice because monsters like him don't look like monsters. But they are. After 3 days of deliberation, the verdict came in. The forewoman stood, her voice trembling slightly. We find the defendant, Marcus Reed, guilty on all counts, including first-degree murder, fraud, and identity theft. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Marcus closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. For the first time, the man who had controlled every room he entered had lost control completely. Laura sat motionless, tears welling but refusing to fall. Justice didn't erase the pain, but it filled the silence her mother had left behind. When the judge handed down the sentence, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, Marcus finally turned toward Laura. His smile was gone. His eyes, once full of charm, were empty. "You'll think of me," he said quietly, almost like a threat. Laura rose to her feet. "Not anymore," she replied. "Now, everyone will know who you really are." As he was led away in chains, the cameras flashed again, capturing the moment the predator's mask finally fell. Outside the courthouse, Laura faced the reporters briefly. "This isn't just my mother's story," she said. "It's every woman's story who believed in love and met a liar instead. Don't ignore the small signs. They could save your life." And with that, she walked away, the daughter who turned grief into justice, leaving behind the courthouse where the man who thought he'd never be caught had finally met his end. The courtroom was empty now. The echoes of the verdict, guilty on all counts, still lingered in Laura Moore's ears like a haunting refrain. For months, she had lived, breathed, and bled for this case. And now it was over. The man who murdered her mother, Marcus Reed, the charming predator who had used love as his weapon, was behind bars for the rest of his life. Outside, the world moved on quickly, as it always does. But for Laura, time slowed. She stood on the courthouse steps long after the cameras had packed up, watching the afternoon light turn gold across the stone pillars. In her hand, she held a small locket that once belonged to her mother. Inside was a photo of Evelyn smiling by the lake, wind in her hair, alive with joy. For the first time since her death, Laura didn't feel rage. She felt quiet. When Marcus was transferred to Clallam Bay Correctional Facility, Laura didn't attend. She didn't need to see him in chains. She'd already seen enough of him to last a lifetime. The prosecutor had offered to let her make a statement at sentencing, but Laura declined. Justice wasn't about words anymore. It was about silence, the kind her mother had been denied, the peace she could finally rest in. In the weeks that followed, Laura went back to work. Her colleagues welcomed her with quiet respect. She wasn't just a detective anymore. She was a survivor's symbol, a reminder of how obsession, manipulation, and love could coexist in the same deadly equation. But the nights were harder. Every time she tried to sleep, she saw Evelyn's house. The empty chair by the window, the lavender teacup, the faint reflection of her mother brushing her hair before bed. Grief had a way of sneaking in through the smallest cracks. Sometimes, Laura would find herself driving to the old lake house without meaning to, parking outside, just watching. One evening, she finally unlocked the front door. Dust had already begun to settle, and the air smelled faintly of her mother's perfume. On the kitchen counter sat a framed photo of Evelyn and Marcus, taken just days before the wedding. Laura's stomach turned at the sight of his arm around her mother's shoulders, the perfect illusion of love. She lifted the frame and turned it over. On the back, in her mother's handwriting, were the words, "For the first time in years, I feel seen." Laura closed her eyes. "You were seen, Mom," she whispered, "just not by the right person." That night, she went through Evelyn's desk, notes, recipes, old business papers, until she found a small leather-bound journal. The last entry, dated a week before the wedding, read, "I don't know if what I feel is love or the fear of being alone, but Marcus makes the silence in this house feel less heavy. Maybe that's enough." Laura traced her fingers over the ink. The words didn't sound like weakness. They sounded human. A woman who had spent her whole life building everything except a place for herself to rest. She placed the journal in her bag. "You deserve better," she said softly. Months passed. The case faded from headlines, replaced by new scandals and tragedies. But for those who had followed it closely, the story of Evelyn Moore and Marcus Reed became a cautionary tale, a reminder that evil doesn't always come with a gun or a knife. Sometimes it comes with a smile and a promise. Laura began speaking quietly at domestic abuse and fraud seminars, sharing her mother's story, not as a detective, but as a daughter. Her message was simple: trust your instincts, even when your heart doesn't want to. And slowly, the grief began to shift into purpose. One autumn afternoon, almost a year to the day after Evelyn's death, Laura visited the lake house one last time. The leaves were red and gold, the water shimmering under a soft breeze. She carried a single bouquet of lavender, her mother's favorite. She set it by the dock where Evelyn used to sit with her morning coffee. For a moment, Laura thought she heard her mother's voice, faint, carried by the wind, a whisper that wasn't words but warmth. She smiled through her tears. "I did it, Mom," she said. "He'll never hurt anyone again." A bird took flight across the water, its reflection rippling against the fading light. As she turned to leave, Laura paused by the door. The sun dipped low, painting the house in amber, and for a brief instant, she imagined Evelyn standing there. Not the lonely widow or the victim, but the strong, radiant woman she had always been. And in that moment, Laura understood something she hadn't before. Her mother's story didn't end with tragedy. It ended with truth. Justice wasn't about revenge. It was about restoration, about giving back what Marcus had tried to erase. Evelyn's dignity, her voice, her legacy. As Laura drove away, the lake shimmered behind her, calm and endless, like the echo of her mother's love that would never fade. And for the first time in a very long time, Detective Laura Moore felt at peace.